I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. On my last article, Unbecoming is a Lie, I linked to 4 of my articles on Charles Eisenstein, speculating that I think he may be intentionally misleading us, and that he is possibly even an intelligence asset who has been hired to do that. I don't know whether all those clues add up. What I do know for a fact is that he has lied in representing my phrase, tonic masculinity, as his own, and also in something he presented as a photograph of a Salvadoran prison that he said a friend had taken, which later was turned out to be AI. Those are significant. Those are times when you know that someone has intentionally misled you. The rest of what I put relies on Alison McDowell and her research, and also on following my own clues. Because of my links to those, Frontera Lupita sent me to an article called Charles Eisenstein, The Great Appeaser, Why Moral Complexity Can Become an Excuse for Doing Nothing. And this is by someone called Turfseer. So I started a conversation with Turfseer where he is comparing Maduro to Hitler from his title, and then Trump to Churchill as the one who did not appease, whereas Chamberlain did. I want to present that discussion and see what you think. Turfseer's article starts with some curious AI art, which has Hitler surrounded by doves shaking hands with a working class guy. And he's shaking hands using his right hand, but attached to his left arm. I don't know whether that was Turfseer's doing, but it is only the beginning of what I felt he got wrong about both Maduro and Hitler. The Charles Eisenstein article he was critiquing is called Venezuela, an Evil Omen. I was surprised to find that I agreed with every word of Charles Eisenstein in that article, but maybe I shouldn't have been surprised because I have always felt that Charles Eisenstein and I are saying the same thing, sometimes with him using the exact same words. So I have connected with different people from his comment threads who I think are wonderful people through that commonality. Turfseer seems like a good and smart person and has written 40 plus songs about the scamdemic. His blog is read by others that I admire, and you can tell by his facility with words that he's a good writer. He cites John Rappaport as the source of a lot of his facts and knowledge in this argument. As I've often said, the important arguments are with people who are on the same side, that speaking truth to power is just empty virtue signaling. So this is a way to try to understand each other's point of view. And I might be wrong. And I hope to hear from you in the comments where you think I might be wrong. In this case, I think we all have our own feedback bubbles, and it's easy for us to think that everyone on the outside who's a reasonable person thinks the same way. But then someday you may be stuck on a plane with a chatty neighbor in the next seat who wants to argue with you about why defending Ukraine is necessary for democracy. And you're going to need to have facts and logics at your fingertip so that you can present things to someone who is starting at the negative information point of mainstream media or faux grassroots media, which is AstroTurf. And after a futile hour, you'll be able to get off that plane. And if you're lucky, there will be a woman you start talking to who was in the front row before you, who will say she was texting her daughter about that well-informed woman who was schooling the guy who was a know-it-all. And She'll ask if you're a professor, and it will all be worth it, that entire squandered hour. So to arm you with those facts and logic, let's do this. My opening comments. Frontera Lupita sent me here because my latest article references several others in which I critique Eisenstein. However, my reasons to critique him are different than yours. I think you're unclear on the concept of sovereignty. If justice is blind, then any statement of ethics needs to be reversible. In example, U.S. presidents may be kidnapped in an assault on the White House, taken to a foreign country and imprisoned, possibly executed. Would you agree that that should not be a violation of international law? What aggression against the U.S. do you think that Maduro committed? You certainly couldn't invoke drug smuggling. First, isn't it the responsibility of Customs and Border Security to keep drugs out of the U.S.? No one is accusing him of forcing drugs on America, as the U.S. did to China during the Opium Wars. And he's not using diplomatic immunity to get drugs in, like the Iran-Contra affair operating from Clinton's hometown airbase when he was governor. At worst, he's allowing drug smugglers to operate out of Venezuela, which would be like making Trump liable for every drug smuggler out of the U.S. But even that's more of a stretch for Maduro than it would be for Trump. Maduro's been accused of owning weapons. Huh? A president in his own home country can't own weapons? If Trump owns any weapons, can he be extradited on that basis? Your comparison to Hitler swallows the lies we've been told about the world wars, and I link an episode with 22 of my articles researching it. Hitler himself was a Rothschild agent, possibly his illegitimate grandson, but certainly that of a wealthy German who identified as a Jew. He was set up to infiltrate the German Workers' Party and sabotage the economic plan of Gottfried Feder that had kicked out Rothschild and returned Germany to full employment. While Neville favored what you call appeasement, Rothschild wanted revenge. So Churchill was put in power, and his gambling debts that were about to lose him his manor were paid off. Churchill was the first to ever bomb civilian cities behind enemy lines, to set up Hitler to bomb London. Enthusiasm for the war was flagging, so Churchill sacrificed London. We're being played by all of these actors, Eisenstein included. Don't fall for it. Turfseer replied, I think you're missing what I'm actually criticizing. This isn't about whether the Maduro operation was clean, legal, or wise. You can believe it was reckless, illegal, or imperial overreach without adopting Eisenstein's worldview. My objection is not America good, Venezuela bad. It's that Eisenstein uses U.S. misconduct as a reason to stop making judgments altogether. That's appeasement. Eisenstein's answer to Maduro did terrible things is always conditions produced him. That sounds thoughtful until you realize it applies to literally everyone, at any time. Once you accept that logic, no leader is ever meaningfully responsible for anything. History becomes therapy, not accountability. He treats moral judgment as childish. Calling someone a bad actor, an aggressor, or a tyrant is dismissed as binary thinking. But history doesn't move forward without drawing lines. Refusing to draw them doesn't make you wise. It just delays consequences until they're worse. That's why the Hitler analogy is relevant, not because Maduro equals Hitler, but because the logic is the same. Appeasers didn't think Hitler was harmless. They thought confrontation was worse. They thought judgment was dangerous. They thought understanding the conditions mattered more than stopping the behavior. And they were catastrophically wrong. As for the alternative history being offered here, Hitler as a Rothschild agent, Churchill sacrificing London, secret banking plots, There's simply no credible historical evidence for any of it. These claims rely on speculation, genealogical guesswork, and reinterpretations that exist almost entirely outside mainstream historical scholarship. You can believe them if you want, but they don't overturn the basic documented reality of how appeasement worked or why it failed. That kind of revisionism doesn't sharpen analysis, it muddies it. It replaces documented history with a grand puppet master narrative that conveniently removes responsibility from the actual actors involved. Ironically, that's the same move Eisenstein makes, just in spiritual language instead of conspiratorial language. I answered, "Thanks for responding, Turfseer. We're both agreeing, maybe, that Eisenstein is intentionally misleading, although perhaps you're saying he's mistaken. Where you differ from Eisenstein is that people should be judged as good or bad, moral or evil, by those assumed to be morally superior. Where I differ from Eisenstein is that behaviors should be judged as good or bad, moral or immoral, no matter who does them. When behaviors in one country affect the people of another, that behavior should be stopped by coordinated action by other countries who stand against it. The first level of nonviolent consequence would be refusing to trade, followed by refusing to trade with anyone who does trade with them. Maduro owning firearms is certainly not a threat to anyone in the U.S. What are his acts of aggression to the U.S.? That's not rhetorical. I want to know what you think. If a country allowing or even enabling drug smuggling into the U.S. is the act of aggression, the president of Mexico should have been kidnapped, followed by the president of Colombia. That would eliminate 90% of the cocaine in the U.S. The fentanyl produced in Mexico is supplied by China and India. So if fentanyl deaths are his concern, Trump should refuse to trade with them until they tighten their own security around the precursor chemicals. Did you read any of my research on Hitler, Turfseer, before calling it speculation, genealogical guesswork, and reinterpretations that exist almost entirely outside mainstream historical scholarship? I will certainly agree with the latter, but I didn't realize that you're someone who thinks the mainstream tells the truth. I haven't met anyone before on Substack who used mainstream as a positive attribute. I don't believe in believing or in authority. I encourage you to either read one of the articles and post there what you disagree with, citing facts and logic, or give the benefit of the doubt that I've done more research in my 25 plus articles than you have and may know things you don't. Rejecting my conclusions without looking at my evidence isn't scholarship. Turfseer wrote, "Thanks for laying this out, Teresa. I think we're closer on some things than it might look at first glance. I agree that behaviors matter and that harmful behaviors affecting other countries should be confronted, preferably through coordinated, non-military means wherever possible. Where I part ways is narrower and simpler. My critique of Eisenstein isn't that he's wrong on the facts, so much as his way of reasoning consistently dissolves responsibility into context. Over time, that habit tends to discourage judgment at precisely the moments when judgment matters. That's what I mean by appeasement, not defending people, but softening responses until lines disappear. On Maduro specifically, I'm not arguing that drug trafficking alone justifies any particular action, nor am I defending a blanket kidnap the leader model. My point is about moral clarity, not endorsing every tactic or precedent. As for the World War II material, I'm not dismissing your work out of hand, and I'm certainly not claiming the mainstream always tells the truth. I am saying that extraordinary historical claims need very strong, widely corroborated evidence, and I don't have the time or interest to wade through dozens of articles to adjudicate them here. If there's one piece you think best represents your case, something concise that you feel stands on its own, I'm open to looking at that. If not, that's fine too. I'm comfortable keeping this discussion focused on Eisenstein's public arguments and the logic behind them. Either way, I appreciate the thoughtful engagement. I wrote, "Thanks for your kind response, Turfseer. I also think we're closer than appears at first glance. We agree on Eisenstein, so there's not much point to quibbling on why. My steps in Have a Better Argument is to state the question, define the terms, and say why it matters. I'm still trying to figure out your position. If not doing anything to Maduro would have been appeasement, what should have been done and on the basis of what actions against the U.S.? How would that apply in reverse? On Hitler, I'll focus on the most recent, in which I state, regardless of whether Hitler's grandfather was Meyer Amschel Rothschild, the important question is whether Schicklgruber was Rothschild's agent, with a play-acting script that subverted Germany's anti-Rothschild rebellion from within, while seeming to be leading it. I'll quote from Judea's War on Germany to show how Hitler was set up by denouncing him and how that forced him to create Israel at Germany's expense. I would assume that we agree on the trope, all wars are bankers' wars. If the world wars were really between Germany and Rothschild, then it's Rothschild and his cronies who defeated Germany. And we're living under the rule of bankers today because we don't understand that. Turfseer. On Maduro, as I understand it, the U.S. claim isn't that Maduro launched a military attack on the U.S., but that his government knowingly enabled large-scale drug trafficking that materially harmed Americans. Whether that justifies the specific tactic used is debatable, but that's the basis being asserted. On Hitler, I appreciate you pointing me to your work, but that historical reconstruction is well beyond my purview and what I was writing about. My analogy was about appeasement logic, not hidden bloodlines or secret scripts. When I hear Hitler or Hamas, I don't start mapping international bankers. My inner lost-in-space robot just lights up and says, "Danger, Will Robinson, danger." Sometimes pattern recognition beats genealogy charts. I replied, "Thanks, but I wasn't asking for the U.S. claim. I'm trying to figure out your position. If not doing anything to Maduro would have been appeasement, what should have been done and on the basis of what actions against the U.S.? How would that apply in reverse? What would you do as president that would not be appeasement?" Turfseer. Fair question. Here's my position drawing largely from John Rappaport's analysis. Appeasement wouldn't have meant do nothing. It would have meant looking the other way while Venezuela became a forward base for rival powers. What should have been done, and justified openly, is confronting concrete strategic threats in our hemisphere. Military advisors from Russia, Iranian drone operations, Chinese control of oil and rare earth minerals, and the use of Venezuela as a hub for regional destabilization. A non-appeasing posture would have been state clearly that foreign military and weapon systems from adversarial powers in our backyard are unacceptable. Demand their removal. Act to dismantle these installations if diplomacy failed, and say that's the reason, not hide behind fuzzy legal or moral narratives. In reverse, I'd expect the same standard. If the U.S. allowed hostile powers to set up military infrastructure near another major power's borders, we shouldn't be shocked if that power pushed back. Where I part company with Eisenstein is that he treats drawing those lines as immoral binary thinking. I don't. Recognizing real strategic danger and acting on it isn't warmongering. It's how you prevent worst outcomes later. I answered, as I've said, I decide my views based on facts and logic, not authority, so I'll respond to those. You write, Venezuela is a hub for regional destabilization. A non-appeasing posture would have been state clearly that foreign military and weapon systems from adversarial powers in our backyard are unacceptable. Demand their removal. By backyard, do you mean the Monroe Doctrine terminology of the Western Hemisphere? So foreign military advisors, drone operations, and control of oil and minerals on another continent in the same hemisphere is unacceptable. I'm happy to see that you and Rappaport are supportive of Russia's defense of its border against all of those U.S. NATO installations placed in Ukraine, although you could add bioweapons labs and puppet governments installed by coup. Should the U.S. start with the removal of its 1,000 global military bases in other people's countries? Turfseer, this is a shocking level of hubris and hypocrisy to say that another continent belongs to the U.S. You write, if the U.S. allowed hostile powers to set up military infrastructure near another major power's borders, we shouldn't be shocked if that power pushed back. What this seems is that might makes right. If a country isn't a major power, then it's perfectly fine to set up military infrastructure, even within its borders. It's only good strategy for the U.S. to be circling Iran and Russia, China with Taiwan. Morality has nothing to do with it. And going back to Hitler, you write, when I hear Hitler or Hamas, I don't start mapping international bankers. My inner lost-in-space robot just lights up and says, "Danger, Will Robinson, danger." That's internalizing the voice of R2-D2 as self-censorship. Abort research mission. Terminate thought immediately. Cognitive dissonance and pitfalls to authority ahead. Prepare to capsize. I don't know what historical reconstruction means. Isn't all history a construction of the past using the clues of facts and logic? What you're saying is, history is well beyond my purview. That's okay, but then don't present history as a precedent on which to base your morality of current events. Turfseer, let me be very clear, because this keeps getting reframed in ways I don't accept. First, no, I am not saying the Western Hemisphere belongs to the U.S. That's your gloss, not my claim. What I am saying is that states react to nearby military threats, whether we like it or not. That's not moral endorsement, it's descriptive reality. Pretending otherwise doesn't make the world safer. It just blinds you to how power actually behaves. Second, pointing out that Russia reacted to NATO expansion does not obligate me to pretend all reactions everywhere are morally equal or strategically wise. You keep collapsing understanding how states behave into endorsing might makes right. I'm doing the former, not the latter. Refusing to recognize danger doesn't make you principled, it makes you unprepared. Third, on hypocrisy, yes, the U.S. has bases all over the world. Yes, that creates blowback. None of that refutes my point about appeasement logic. Saying America has done worse things is not an argument against identifying real threats or drawing lines anywhere ever. It's just a veto on judgment. Fourth, and this matters, I am not obligated to accept your historical reconstruction as a prerequisite for discussion. History is constructed, but not all constructions are equally grounded. When a framework requires secret handlers, inverted villains, hidden scripts, and demands that skepticism be treated as intellectual failure, I am allowed to say, this is beyond my scope and not persuasive to me. That's not self-censorship. It's discernment. Which brings me to Hitler. My Lost in Space line wasn't abort thought. It was the opposite. Some patterns are obvious enough that you don't need a 30-page genealogy to recognize danger. When an ideology produces mass violence, territorial conquest, and industrialized killing, my moral antenna don't wait for a banking flowchart to activate. If that's not a conversation you want to have, that's fine. But I'm not surrendering judgment just to keep the debate going. I answered, I keep reframing your arguments using ethical consistency so that the same behavior under the same circumstances is right or wrong no matter who's doing it. Your subtitle is Why Moral Complexity Can Become an Excuse for Doing Nothing. You define doing nothing as appeasement. Your argument is that Trump was morally justified, even obligated, to do something about Maduro because he supposedly allowed foreign military and weapons systems from adversarial powers in our backyard. Our backyard was your phrase. Venezuela isn't in the U.S. and doesn't border the U.S. It's an entirely different continent with many other countries between it and us. You call it our backyard, but according to you, you're not saying the Western Hemisphere belongs to the U.S. What does the word our mean? Is that your AI art, by the way, in which Hitler's right hand extends from his left arm? You have a peace dove flying above, an edelweiss flower between them, and he's shaking hands with a nice working-class guy above the bold title, The Great Appeaser. So you're comparing Maduro to Hitler and Charles Eisenstein to Neville Chamberlain. But this is just descriptive reality and not a statement about morality? You say this is about how states behave. States don't have behaviors. Only humans do. Eisenstein's article, which I've now read, is a severe critique of Trump's behavior as a new frontier in lawlessness. I'm not an Eisenstein fan, but I agree with every word in his article. You're all for judging Maduro as good or bad and acting on it, but we should not be judging Trump's actions as good or bad. Would we not be appeasers of Trump if we don't sort through the moral complexity of when it's justified to kidnap a foreign president? Venezuela is 2,000 miles away from the U.S. Is 2,000 miles what you consider near our border? Are you suggesting that it poses a danger to the U.S.? From my sources, it's Israel who considers Venezuela a threat, which is even further away. Ukraine is on the actual border of Russia, who had removed their own nuclear weapons on the condition that it be kept neutral. You say pointing out that Russia reacted to NATO expansion does not obligate me to pretend all reactions everywhere are morally equal or strategically wise. So Trump taking over a country 2,000 miles away is an act of defense. But Putin responding to a U.S. coup and NATO military on Russia's border is not morally equal or strategically wise. I have never asked you to accept my conclusions. You asked for the evidence to be put into one article and then refused to read it. You're not disagreeing with me because you have no idea what I say in the article. If you had, you wouldn't put nonsense like a 30-page genealogy and force me to repeat a third time that I'm looking at Hitler as Rothschild's agent. But let's go with the mainstream narrative. Your argument is Maduro bad, Hitler bad, therefore appeasement bad. You see Hitler as an ideology that produced mass violence, territorial conquest, and industrialized killing. Let's compare Maduro to Netanyahu on those three measures. Can you give any example of these for Maduro? I could and have filled multiple articles with examples for Netanyahu. So if you're looking at these as the danger signs that people miss until it's too late, don't you think we should be kidnapping Netanyahu and his wife and putting them on trial? I just heard that Maduro's wife is being denied medical care for the bruises on her face and broken ribs inflicted during the assault. Is this behavior you think is self-defense? Because it seems like egotistical thugs to me. I don't know how any moral person can defend it. Turfseer wrote, "Here's the basic problem with your framing, Teresa. You keep redefining ethical consistency as nobody gets to act unless the world is already morally perfect. That isn't consistency, it's a veto. A few direct pushbacks. 1. Millions are cheering isn't CIA mind control, it's evidence of regime hatred. You don't have to like Trump to acknowledge a plain reality. Large numbers of Venezuelans, especially in the diaspora, celebrated Maduro's removal. That doesn't automatically make every U.S. tactic wise, but it does undercut the idea that this was simply an unprovoked kidnapping of a beloved, legitimate leader. 2. Our backyard is about threat proximity, not Venezuela belongs to us. No, Venezuela isn't the U.S., and I'm not arguing for annexation. I'm saying that when hostile powers put advisors, weapon systems, and infrastructure in a state that is already a regional destabilizer, you don't have to wait for a missile to land in Florida to notice the smoke. Distance is not a magic force field in the era of drones, signals intelligence, and forward bases. 3. Your reverse it test is fine, but it doesn't prove what you think it proves. If Venezuela or any state had credible evidence that a U.S. president was running a transnational criminal enterprise that harmed Venezuelans at scale, I'd expect consequences too. Sanctions, seizures, prosecutions, maybe even covert action. The real issue isn't, is action ever allowed? It's who has the capability to enforce anything and what thresholds justify what actions. International politics is messy because enforcement is uneven, not because morality doesn't exist. 4. States don't have behavior is just wordplay. 5. Why not kidnap Netanyahu is rhetorical jujitsu, not analysis. 6. On the wife's injury, if true, it's unacceptable, full stop. 7. Your World War II banker detour doesn't strengthen your moral argument. It distracts from it. You keep insisting I must litigate your entire historical reconstruction to be allowed to use appeasement as a warning label. No, the appeasement analogy is about a pattern of reasoning. Everything is complex, therefore don't confront obvious aggressors until too late. When I hear Hitler or Hamas, my inner lost-in-space robot isn't self-censoring. It's doing what it was built to do. Danger, Will Robinson, because sometimes danger is just danger. If you want the clean version of my position on what should have been done, draw a bright line against hostile military infrastructure and foreign power projection in Venezuela. Use escalating pressure, diplomatic, economic first, covert, disruptive second, tied to concrete demands. Reserve force for narrow objectives, not imperial fantasies. That is not might makes right. That's recognizing that evil doesn't disappear because we wrote a beautiful paragraph about its childhood trauma. I replied, here's how I would describe our positions. Correct me if you disagree. You, individuals and states should be judged as good or bad, and good ones need to take actions to control bad ones. Me, behaviors of individuals and states should be judged as good or bad, based on the benefit or harm of those actions to other individuals or states, and the rule of law between them should consistently apply consequences. I define evil as causing others to cause harm. I think of ethical statements as algebra equations. It needs to be reversible around the equal sign, and any variable, proper noun, needs to be replaceable with any other in the same category. So let's apply that to your ethical statement of what is legitimate for countries to do. Draw a bright line against hostile military infrastructure and foreign power projection in the Middle East? Do you continue to hold to that statement? Now let's say, draw a bright line against hostile military infrastructure and foreign power projection in Latin America. Certainly, U.S. military and covert operations have a very long history in Latin America. This action by the U.S. is a foreign power projection, yes? U.S. military attacking a foreign country's capital, killing or bribing guards, and abducting a president and his wife is a hostile military action. How can you draw a bright line against the very thing that you're doing? What I find very disturbing is your assumption of your own superiority to judge other countries, while being oblivious or excusing of your own. Maduro's actions in Venezuela are the business of Venezuelans. Trump's actions are your business. Do other countries get to decide if U.S. leaders should be removed, other than Israel, who does decide that? Again, terms need to be applied unilaterally. If 2,000 miles equals threat proximity, then there should be no U.S. military infrastructure and foreign power projection within 2,000 miles of another sovereign country, much less in it. You write, if Venezuela or any state had credible evidence that a U.S. president was running a transnational criminal enterprise that harmed Venezuelans at scale. I'm sorry, but I'm flabbergasted. I don't know how to begin to respond to a statement so naive. Instead of addressing my arguments, you call them wordplay, rhetorical jujitsu, and distractions. Your argument rests on a comparison to a history that proves that a dangerous ideology can cause mass violence, territorial conquest, and industrialized killing. I am agreeing with you, but saying that ideology won the world wars and exactly is what you're defending today. It's not me insisting you accept my World War history to make my argument. It's your argument that rests entirely on the mainstream narrative of good guys won because warmonger Churchill replaced the Great Appeaser Chamberlain. We can mutually agree to set the world wars aside because my argument is based on ethical consistency, not historical precedents. However, you're also rejecting ethical consistency. You write you're swapping the topic, Venezuela, for a different moral case, Israel, to force a global equivalence test. That's a classic way to avoid the specific question, what do you do about Maduro's regime and Venezuela becoming a platform for adversarial power projection and criminal enterprise? So Maduro and Venezuela are to be seen in isolation. There are no laws that could govern international actions because each instance is unique, to be decided by the morally superior U.S. or England or France or Israel or whoever else has power. That's not dealing with moral complexity. It's moral simplification to us good, them bad. You like identifying with those in power as strong and decisive, even when they go rogue and lawless. That is an imperial fantasy, not an ethical framework. Turfseer. Teresa, I think you're mischaracterizing my position, and in doing so, you're smuggling in a standard that no state on earth actually operates under. First, yes, the U.S. has violated sovereignty before. We violated Iran's sovereignty when we struck its nuclear facilities. We did it because Iran openly threatened us and our allies and was pursuing capabilities that would materially change the strategic balance. You can call that immoral if you want, but almost no one seriously argues it was incomprehensible. States act preemptively when they perceive real danger. That's not hubris. It's how survival works. Second, Venezuela is not some neutral, self-contained moral island. Maduro didn't just govern badly. His regime confiscated foreign oil assets with little or no compensation, collapsing production and wrecking contracts. Presided over a narco-state that pushed regional instability outward. Invited adversarial powers into the country as leverage against the U.S. and its neighbors. At that point, it stops being only Venezuelans' business. Harm radiates outward. I wrote back, I invited you to correct my characterization of our positions on ethics. You, people and states are good or bad. Good ones do bad things, which are good when they do them. Me, behaviors are good or bad, irrespective of who does them. Neither of us is determining foreign policy. We are, as individuals, talking about our own moral framework and how the abduction of Maduro fits in. You approve Trump's action because it protects your survival and ethics don't matter to you. It's Trump's job to keep you safe, and that's all that matters. Oil reserves had nothing to do with it. He cares about you. Whatever threat he tells you, you believe, just like Operation Warp Speed. Let's say, hypothetically, Iran was developing nuclear weapons capabilities, like the U.S., the only country to have used them, and like their neighbor Israel, who stole its nuclear secrets from the U.S. Trump attacked right when they were negotiating a nuclear treaty. Are you now safer, since all countries know that nuclear treaties are just a ruse? You say that would shift the strategic balance. Well, duh. What you want is a strategic imbalance that enables Israel to act with impunity in the Middle East, with no fear of retaliation. That's not ethics, it's exceptionalism. Your ethical position is imperialist because you can't state the rules without first stating the players. I am a sovereigntist because I think rules apply to everyone or no one. You're correct that we'll never agree because imperialism and sovereignty are opposite and mutually exclusive. This debate went on much longer, which I recorded, but apparently Goddess decided that enough was enough and accidentally disconnected my microphone. So I'm going to take the hint and not re-record that and assume that if you want more of my points, you can go to thirdparadigm.substack.com where the full transcript will be. And you can also tell me if you think I'm not being fair to Turfseer. I end with the point of saying I'm not for inaction against action. That is a false paradigm. I am a full defender of the right of armed resistance. That is an action, but it's an action in defense of sovereignty against empire. So that's the real debate, not action versus inaction or appeasement. This is really about empire versus sovereignty. Substack also has some bonus information from my original draft, which was, Is Putin Hitler? And that analogy holds up much better when we look at Ukraine and Poland and the buildup of military and provocations on the border, and also the number of people who were originally Russian or German who were on the wrong side of that border and being treated in a way that was horrible. And in case it is within your purview to challenge the mainstream narrative of history, Here on the non-appeaser is Churchill's atrocities. And this one is Corbett and Unz, the unnecessary war. Thank you for watching.